Hi class, here are our lesson objectives for today. We have our I can statements. I can understand the causes and effects of the Vietnam War, and I can role play to create solutions to major problems that occurred during the Vietnam War. I bet you'll never guess this by looking at the lesson objectives on the last slide, but the main event for the 1960s is the Vietnam War. So at this point, we finished the 1950s and we're going to jump into the 1960s. Unlike the 1950s, where we focused on the social goals of that time period, we're back to main events. And in this decade, the Vietnam War consumed the entire decade, and even more than the entire decade. And we'll talk about that in this lesson. So before we talk about the Vietnam War and how we got involved and what happened and whether or not we won the Vietnam War, let's actually look at where Vietnam is on the map. Now, if you look at this map, you're looking at the country of Vietnam. Vietnam is in Asia. That's the continent that the country Vietnam is located on. Now, if you look at the little globe that you can see on this map, you see that there's an arrow pointing to Vietnam. You see that the orange, like that kind of, I guess, pale red color is Asia, and Vietnam is kind of right below it. So it's above Australia, around Japan area, Korea. It's obviously right below China and around the countries Laos and Cambodia. Now, today, Vietnam is divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but it hasn't always been that way. After World War II, one of the things that happened is a lot of boundaries got shifted around in the peace treaties to end World War II. And in North Vietnam, the people that decided to write the peace treaty for the 1940s after World War II, they decided to split Vietnam into two countries. Now, they were very creative with the names that they named those two countries. The North one was North Vietnam, and the South one was South Vietnam. They used to be the same country, but now they're two different countries. And what happened is because they were two countries, they each to kind of develop their own government, and those governments were vastly different. So when we start the Vietnam War, this is the situation happening in the country. The country's been divided and they have two very different governments. The Vietnam War started in the year 1955 and it lasted for the next 20 years, ending in the year 1975. So we're talking about a war that lasts 2 decades. The war that we've talked about already in this class is World War II. Now, that war lasted 6 years, 4 years if you were in America. And that was a huge war where a lot of things changed and a lot of people's lives were vastly different because of that war. And if you look at the Vietnam War, though, this is a 20-year war. So imagine what happens in that 20-year time period. So what we've got to do before we talk about America being involved in the Vietnam War and what happened in the war and what the effects of it were, let's actually understand what actually caused this war to be 20 years long. So the war starts because in North Vietnam, they had what's called a communist dictator. His name was Ho Chi Minh. Now, let's look at those words, communist and dictator. What a dictator is a dictator is a leader of a country that has all power. It means that he has no limits to what he can do. No one can tell him what to do, and even the law cannot tell a dictator what to do. Dictators often become really, really bad people, and they start doing things they shouldn't do, like killing their enemies, per se. Anyone that speaks out against them, they say, oh, well, I'm just going to go kill you because I have all the power and I want to remain in power and have all the power and I want my children to have all the power. That's what they start thinking. Sometimes they start off as good people and they say, oh, I just want to help my country out. But then they become kind of tyrannical in their search for power, and then they start making bad choices. So dictators are not good. And the kind of dictator that Ho Chi Minh was a communist dictator. The word communist describes the kind of government that North Vietnam had at the time. The government that they had was a communist government. Communism is a type of government that is opposite of what we have in America. In America, our government is called a democracy. But in a communist government, their government runs extremely different than ours does. In a democracy, we focus on human rights. We focus on protecting people. We focus on limiting the power of the government. In a communist government, they don't do that at all. And in fact, people don't have a lot of rights in a communist government, and the government gets to do whatever they want. Hence why dictators often rise to power in communist governments, because they get to tell people what to do and make all the laws for the nation. Now, communist governments believe that everybody needs to be equal, and they need to be so equal, in fact, that the government has all control and all power in their lives. In communist governments, is no such thing as private property. The government owns everything. There's no such thing as religion, because the government is the ultimate a source of knowledge and power that you should look to, not to religion. So they say you can't be a part of any religion in a communist government. They say, oh, well, in order for society to run well, we're going to pick the jobs and we're going to pick the salary of everyone. And in fact, everyone is going to get the same salary. So if you're a garbage truck man, you get to have the same salary as a doctor. So often when a government decides to become communist, people get really upset and they leave the government and they say, oh, I don't want to be part of a society or a country at all that's going to pay me and all the training and experience I have as a doctor the same as a garbage man. I don't want to be paid the same. And so the reason communist governments do this is because they say, well, in communism, we want everyone to be equal. So the trash man shouldn't feel like he's less than the doctor. And we're going to help out the society to be equal and especially take care of the poor. So that way it doesn't happen. So sometimes communism sounds like a good idea, but it always ends up badly. Okay, there's your crash course in communism. So basically, communism is the opposite of democracy, and a lot of people's rights get taken away in communism. It really just never works out well for anybody except the dictator who gets to do whatever he wants in a communist government. So North Vietnam, they kind of got the idea of communism from China, who did it before them. And before China, it was Russia, and it was other thinkers like a guy called Karl Marx that invented communism. And so people started saying, oh, in their countries, we want to do communism. So North Vietnam said, we're going to be the next country to do communism. And Ho Chi Minh became the director, the dictator of communism in the country. So here's what started to happen. When he started to get a lot of power and became a communist dictator, we got nervous in America and we said, we don't really like the idea of communism and you're doing some kind of dangerous things and you're abusing your people and we don't believe in that. We don't believe in taking away the rights of your people. So the president at the time who first did something about North Vietnam, his name was John F. Kennedy, and we just call him JFK for short. So President JFK, he sent some troops to Vietnam, and they were sent there not to fight, but to just kind of keep an eye on things. So he was the first one to authorize troops to be sent to Vietnam. And here's what he looks like. Then what happens with JFK is he's actually assassinated when he's president. And so when he is no longer president, his vice president becomes the president. And so Lyndon B. Johnson, at this time that we're going to start really talking about the Vietnam War, Lyndon B. Johnson has just become president. So JFK was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson is made president. So do you see this lovely picture of JFK? Well, now the new president is this ugly old guy. Lyndon B. Johnson. He was not a good-looking man. We can say that objectively. So when Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, he has to make a decision. Does he continue sending these troops to Vietnam, which is what JFK did, or does he actually say, okay, well, we got to do something here, and we got to have our troops actually fight, and we got to have them start saving the Vietnamese from communism, and we got to protect ourselves from communism. That's kind of his choice. Well, the choice kind of gets made for him because something really horrible happens in North Vietnam. We had a bunch of ships that were just like patrolling the waters and keeping an eye on things and maintaining a presence. And one of our ships was called the USS Maddox. And this is a picture of that ship. Well, what happens is the North Vietnamese blew up our ship. And when that happened, that was considered an act of war. And when they blew up our ship, Congress heard about it, and Congress said, you know what, we've got to declare war. And we need to fight the North Vietnamese because they're aggressors. We need to stop communism. And we need to show them that they can't just go blowing up our ships. Our ship was in their waters, that's true, but it was just minding its own business, and we can't have that. So Lyndon B. Johnson said, okay, we're going to need to go to war. And so Congress said, you know, Lyndon B. Johnson, we're going to give you the power to do whatever you need to do in order to win this war for us. So you can send as many troops as you want. You can do whatever you need in order to make sure that we fight the Vietnamese and we show them who's the boss and we take care of communism in North Vietnam. Okay, so at this point in our assignment, I'm going to explain to you what your assignment actually is. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be at the war room. Now, every war that is ever fought has what's called a war room. And in the war room is where decisions about the war are made. That's where generals decide how many troops to send, they decide where to send them, they decide how to fight, they decide strategy. That all happens in the war room. So the most strategic military thinkers are there. And what you're going to do is I'm going to walk you through some decisions you're going to need to make for your assignment about the Vietnam War. This is going to be kind of like the lesson we did on the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the Black Hawk War, where you're going to be presented with a problem and you're going to need to decide what do you do to solve the problem. And once you've made your decision, I'll have you pause the video and then I'll have you push play again and I'll tell you what really happened in the Vietnam War. Now, in the war room with you, there are 3 other very important people. So you're the one making the decision, but you're going to hear the opinions of 3 different people. And each of them has a problem they're going to tell you about. And then you're going to need to decide what do you do with that in the Vietnam War. So what you know right now is you know the war has started because the North Vietnamese blew up our ship and we just got to go fight them. Now they're going to present to you the 3 different problems. And those people are right here. The first person in the war room that you're going to need to know about is a guy called Robert McNamara. He's what's called the Secretary of State, and this is a picture of him. Now, the Secretary of State is an advisor for the president. The president has a lot of different advisors because he doesn't know everything about everything, so he has to have advisors that are specialists in certain areas. And the Secretary of State is the guy that's in charge of anything that has to do with a foreign country. So he's going to know all about foreign countries. He's going to know maybe some different languages. He's going to know about different cultures. He's going to know how to interact with different cultures. And he's going to know about their history of different countries. And so he gets to advise the president on international affairs and things having to do with other countries. Now, the next guy in the war room is President Lyndon B. Johnson. The president is what's considered he's considered the guy in charge. He's the chief military officer of the war. So he's the commander-in-chief. He's the one in charge of the troops. And so the president makes those decisions regarding the troops in the country as the commander-in-chief. Now, the third guy in the war room is a guy called William Westmoreland. He's the commander of the American forces. As you can see, he has a lot of different medals on his uniform. So he has a lot of military experience, and he knows about soldiers, and he knows about the military and about strategy. So these are the 3 people in the war room. And what I want you to do is continue listening to the video, and I'll tell you when I want you to pause and when I want you to write down your solution to the problem. This will be part of your assignment, and then there's a second part of your assignment you'll do at the very end. Just make sure you're following all the instructions that I tell you in the video. Okay, let's go. Okay, so the first problem you're going to hear about is Robert McNamara's problem. And this problem happens in the year 1964. So in 1955 was when President JFK first sent troops to Vietnam. And it would take another 5, 6, 7 years in order for things to really heat up and get really fishy. But by 1964 is when we're in this. Now we're sending troops to fight in Vietnam. Well, Robert McNamara has a problem. His problem is this. When the Vietnam War first starts and we start sending soldiers, the American public is not so sure about the war. They know that our ship got blown up in North Vietnam. They know that North Vietnam is communist and they don't like that, but they're not sure this is something we should be going to war about. They know that the North Vietnamese haven't come to America to attack us. They know they've just blown up a ship, but they're not sure it's it's exactly the right thing to do. They're thinking maybe this is an overreaction to what happened, and they're not so sure they want to support the war. And then you had another problem. In the beginning of the Vietnam War, when Congress said, okay, we got to start sending troops, what happened is they also made a law. And the law said that there needed to be a draft. What a draft is it means that if your name is called by the government, you have to go fight. In times where America goes to war, when it's a big war and they really need a lot of soldiers, they don't have enough soldiers to just to rely on, because people are always signing up to be in the military. But when there's an actual war like this, they don't have enough people to rely on. So what they have to do is make a draft. And the draft says, well, if your name is called, you have to go fight. You don't have a choice. If you don't fight, basically it means that you're breaking the law and you can be arrested. And so what a draft says is it targets the young people in society. It's not the teenagers, but we're talking about the young college-age people. These are the people that just graduated high school, that are 18 to 25 years old, and they're starting really their lives as an adult, but now they have to go to the draft and they have to go to war. And so the public wasn't so sure they wanted this to happen, because they were saying, well, these are our boys, these are our young men, and we're not really sure we want to fight this war. So why are we going to send them to where we're not really sure we're going to fight? So here's what Robert McNamara has to say about this. He says, the government, us in the war room, want to fight and win this war to stop communism from spreading here and destroying our lives. We understand the big picture, but the American people are not so sure about being involved in a war in a country they can't even point out on a map. Because of the draft, American families are going to have to risk their sons' lives in this war. We know why we want this war, but we need to convince the public that they want it too. What can we tell them to help them stop worrying and support the war in Vietnam? So what I want you to do is I want you to answer that last question here. Now you know the problem for Robert McNamara for decision number 1. On a Google Doc, I want you to type in your answer to this question. And I want you to think about what can you tell the public to help them stop worrying and support the war in Vietnam. So go ahead, pause the video right now and write your decision to number 1. Okay, so at this point, you should have already written your decision for number 1. And let me tell you what they actually decided to do. So the government said, well, we know people aren't so sure about this war, and we know that they're really sad about sending their young boys to fight in this war they're not so sure about. So here's what the government decided to do. They decided to talk a lot about communism. They decided to say that if communism is allowed to be in any country in the entire world, it could convince other countries around it to be communist as well. And so if one country's communist, then the countries around it could turn communist, and then what could happen is communism will start spreading, and it could spread all the way till it gets to us. So they decided to talk about communism is horrible and it takes away the rights of people. So we have to stop it before it could come to our country and take away our rights. So they talked about how bad communism was, and they talked about how we should be scared of it coming to our country to take away our rights. Then the other thing they said, well, don't worry, guys. This will be a short war. We'll just get in there, we'll take care of the dictator, we'll take care of the North Vietnamese troops, and we'll stop communism. It'll be over as, like, you'll just blink and it'll be over, and it'll be a short war. So don't even worry about this stretching out. Now, I've already told you the war lasted 20 years, so we know that that was not true about the Vietnam War. And the last thing they said is they told the public lies. Now, to this point, they've kind of been telling a truth, but they actually started intentionally lying to the American people. What happened is as soon as our troops got to Vietnam and started fighting, they realized, oh, this is actually not going to be a short war. We are in for a lot of challenges with the Vietnam War. And so what happened is they started lying about the number of people that were dying. And what started happening is they would say, okay, maybe in one of the battles, 100,000 men died. And when they would print the number in the newspaper, they would say in the official statements, they'd be like, yeah, 70,000 men died. Don't even worry about that. And that's a really large number. It's just the first one I thought of. So they would started saying, well, less people died than really did die. And then they started lying and saying we were winning. They knew at a certain point in the war that we were not winning the Vietnam War, but they were telling the American people that we were. So not only did they say, okay, we got to stop communism from spreading and it's going to be short, but then they started lying about what was really happening to try to convince the American people to continue fighting and supporting the Vietnam War. Okay, so let's go to decision number 2. Now, William Westmoreland, he has a problem as well. We learned about Robert McNamara's problem, but now the commander of all the troops has an issue, and he's going to tell you about this issue. Well, when our troops first got to North Vietnam, they encountered very different terrain than they were used to. Vietnam is a very hot and a very humid country, and in Vietnam there's a lot of jungle. So when our men got off the plane, they were like, oh my goodness, we just stepped into a jungle. They'd never seen anything like this. And I want you to imagine that you have to live in the jungle and you have to walk in the jungle every day. There are going to be lots of challenges walking in the jungle every day. There's bugs in the jungle. It's hot. You're going to be sweaty. It's humid. You're going to be wet because the jungle, in order for it to stay as green as it does, it's going to have to rain every day in the jungle. So your feet are going to be wet. You're going to be walking in the mud. Then the foliage is going to be really dense. There's going to be lots of trees and lots of undergrowth and a lot of different terrain than you're used to seeing anywhere in the United States. So when our soldiers got to Vietnam, they were not prepared for the jungle that they saw. Here's a picture of the jungle. This is from the Vietnam War. You can see our soldiers here, and then you can see the jungle. So they weren't used to just walking around a jungle. But the North Vietnamese, they were used to that. That was their home. They knew how to navigate the jungle. The soldiers that we were fighting in North Vietnam, they were called the Viet Cong. That was the name for the North Vietnamese troops. We actually teamed up with South Vietnam in the Vietnamese War. So they were in the Vietnam War. They were fighting with us, and we were fighting against the North Vietnamese, which were called the Viet Cong. This is a picture of the Viet Cong. Let me tell you a little bit about the Viet Cong. They didn't have the best weapons. They were not a rich country in North Vietnam, so they couldn't afford to have the greatest guns and the greatest bombs and helicopters and things like that. But what they lacked in weaponry, they actually made up for with their brains. They had some really good ideas about how to fight the war. First off, they knew how to walk around the jungle. It was their home. And they knew how to navigate around because they were used to it. It was their backyard. So they knew how to use the jungle to their advantage. And what they did is they didn't have these awesome bunkers and things that they could build because they weren't rich. But what they could build is a lot of underground tunnels. And this is an example of the kind of underground tunnels that they built. Take a look at what you're seeing in these underground tunnels. This is just a drawing of the kind of tunnels that they would create. So you can see that at the very top is like the regular jungle. So you could be walking along and you're not going to see anything because these underground tunnels were completely underground other than some of the ventilation shafts that you're seeing. And the kitchen kind of was disguised. So then they have, seriously, a full-on kitchen here that they're cooking with. Then they have a way to get water. They have an ammunition dump where they would store all their ammunitions and guns. They had a first aid station with legit bunk beds in there. And then you see that there's a guy like crawling in the tunnels. Then they have like places for you to sleep. There's some hammocks in there and ventilation shafts. Then we have some guards. And you see the stake traps and the different stakes that are pointing up. They knew how to weaponize these, and it would be kind of like a trap, like it would be disguised. And if you stepped in the wrong area and fell through, you'd fall on one of those stakes. And those stakes were sometimes poisoned. And so they were intended to kill you. And so the Viet Cong had a lot of really good ideas about how to fight this war. They didn't have the best tech, but they had a really good know-how of the jungle and how to create these awesome underground tunnels. So this is the enemy that the Americans were fighting. They were fighting in a jungle. They didn't know how to walk around, and they were fighting people that could just suddenly disappear in the jungle and then escape into these underground tunnels. Now you can probably think of different ways that we could fight these underground tunnels, but in the beginning we had to figure out what was going on and what we could do in order to win this war. Now, the other thing the Viet Cong did is they would use regular Vietnamese civilians in villages as spies. This is an example of a regular village in Vietnam. So you can see that they're not very rich people. This is a poor village. But when the Americans would come to different camps and villages of the Vietnamese, they wouldn't know who was a person that was a regular civilian that was innocent and who was a spy and who was communicating with the Viet Cong. So that was very difficult for them because they would say, well, I don't know if this person is innocent or guilty, and I don't know who I can trust, and I don't know where I can get food, and I don't know if this person is going to hurt me if I talk to them. So this was a very difficult thing for the American troops. So now on to decision number 2. William Westmoreland knew that this was happening in Vietnam. He knew that the Viet Cong were really proving to be tough enemies, and they knew the jungle was pretty bad. So here's what his problem is. He's going to propose something to you that you're going to decide, do you think this is a good idea or not? Here's what he has to say. My troops are having trouble surviving in the jungle in Vietnam and fighting the Viet Cong. They surprise attack us in the jungle and we can't even find their tunnels. I propose that we use chemicals to set fire to and destroy the jungle so we can find the Viet Cong and fight them better. We have never used these kinds of chemicals before and don't know what kind of effect they will have, but I think that what matters now is that we win at all costs. This is the way to win. Should we drop the chemicals on Vietnam? So what I want you to do right now is I want you to pause the video and I want you to write your decision for number 2. Do you want to use the chemicals? Why or why not? Okay, so at this point you should have already written your decision for number 2. Now let me tell you what really happened. William Westmoreland decided to drop the chemicals on Vietnam. And so we did what was called chemical warfare. Now this wasn't just kind of chemicals like Windex. They weren't like spraying Windex on the jungle. These were intense chemicals that were designed to burn and to be noxious and to be deadly poison. Okay, the 2 chemicals that were used in Vietnam was a chemical called napalm and another chemical called Agent Orange. Now napalm they would put in bombs, and napalm was a sticky, burning, toxic chemical. And what would happen is when the bombs would explode, the napalm would splatter and just start burning. Agent Orange is an anti-defoliage, and so what that does is, this is actually a picture of Agent Orange right here. This is a plane that's dumping Agent Orange onto the jungle. That was intended to just be a poison to kill the jungle. And so in Vietnam, we dumped 23 million gallons out of planes. And so we dumped 23 million gallons of Agent Orange on the country. And so planes would just drive by and drop these toxic chemicals. Now, I want you to imagine the kind of effect that these chemicals had on the jungle and on the life that's in the jungle. It had a terrible effect. It was noxious. It was toxic. And that had a terrible effect. But there's also an effect that it had on the people. We thought it was just going to burn the plants up, but really it affected the people that came in contact with these toxic chemicals. These were not just Windex that were spraying on the jungle, just like I said. And these chemicals were so toxic, it causes cancer in people. And it wasn't just the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong that it was causing cancer in. It was causing cancer in the regular people in the villages that this Agent Orange was dumped on. And it was causing cancer in our own men. A lot of people, when they came back from Vietnam, they said that they suffered a lot of effects in their body and they got a lot of cancers and a lot of bad things happening to their organs later on in their life because they were exposed to these chemicals. And today, the Vietnamese are still affected by these chemicals that were dumped on them 60 years ago. in the 1960s. And so even today in some villages, some of the Vietnamese are born with birth defects because of the toxic chemicals in the environment and in the bodies of the mom. And some people are even sick today because of this, which is so crazy. They just dump these chemicals without thinking about it, and these turned out to be very, very bad, long-lasting effects of these toxic chemicals. Now, we're going to move on to our third person in the war room, which is Lyndon B. Johnson, and we're going to get our third decision. Now, the year is now 1970, so the war has really been going on since 1964 when we had our first decision with Robert McNamara. And at this point, it's been 6 years of fighting, and the American public in the beginning, they weren't so sure about the war, but by now, they're mad about the war. And Lyndon B. Johnson doesn't know what to do about people being so upset about this. One of the reasons they were so upset is because they figured out the government was lying. Remember, I told you the government was pretending that we were winning, and they were pretending that not so much death was happening. Well, what happened in the 1960s is a lot of reporters went to Vietnam, and this was different than in the 1940s with World War II, because technology had increased so much that the reporters could go to Vietnam and tape and take pictures of what was actually happening. And then the reporters would report it on the news. And so what started happening is people in their homes were then seeing these horrible things that were happening in Vietnam. They were seeing like pictures of burnt up villages and pictures of the jungle that was destroyed by the chemicals. And they were seeing dead bodies of these boys that were drafted into the war. And so the American public started getting so upset. And they started saying, how can you say we're winning when all these horrible things are happening that we're seeing on the news? And the reporters are saying, you know what? We actually think that the government's lying. And we think that they're not telling us the truth about this. And so the American public was like, what? But now I know what's really going on, and I don't believe the government very much at all. And then they said, well, our leaders are still sending our young boys to fight. Why is this still happening if we aren't winning? We don't like this war at all. And then what started happening is people started protesting the war. They started saying, you know what? I'm so mad about this. I want to protest. They would hold parades in the streets and they would say, I don't like this. And they would tell the president they didn't like it. And they would write letters and they would hold signs and they would complain. And so people started protesting the war. And one thing they did is they went to LBJ in the White House and they would chant at him. And they would chant a specific phrase for him to hear. And this was the phrase. They said, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So it was meant to rhyme and be something they could remember and chant. But he talked about when he was in the White House hearing this, it would just make him sob and sob. He didn't know what to do because he thought, well, if we stop fighting the war, then it means that we lose. And it means we come home and it means we did that for nothing. But if we keep fighting the war, more death is happening. And the second thing they did to protest, besides doing marches and parades, is they would write songs about protesting. And a lot of celebrities started saying, hey, we don't like the war, and so we're going to put that into our music. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to view video clip number 1. Video clip number 1 is an example of a protest song. This is my favorite protest song from the Vietnam War because it tells a story. And the story is about someone who goes to the war and the effects that the war is having on him. So I want you to go ahead and view the video clip number 1, and I want you to listen to the story and tell me how this song is protesting the war. Go ahead and think about that as you watch it. So go ahead and pause the video right now and watch video clip number 1. Okay, so at this point you should have already viewed video clip number 1. Did you see the story? Did you see how when the soldier comes back from the war that people are really upset at him and his dad calls him a killer and he can't really function the same that he did before because he has what's called PTSD. Before this, people didn't know about PTSD, but the Vietnam War taught us a lot about PTSD and the effect that war has on the mind of our soldiers when they come back home. So it's a really sad story that that song tells. Now, there's a third way that people started protesting the war. There was a new movement of people that really became popular during the Vietnam War, and they became popular because they reacted to the war and they didn't like it, and instead they said, you know, I hate the war, and I'm going to tell people all about it. And that group of people was called the hippies. So I'm sure you've heard of hippies before. But they came around in the 1960s because they did not like the Vietnam War. The hippies, they actually hated the 1950s three goals. They were the kids during the 1950s, and they didn't remember about the Great Depression and World War II, and they were not happy during the 1950s, and they felt smothered by the three goals. They didn't like consuming, they didn't like conforming, and they really didn't like being wholesome. And so they decided to be rebellious, and they said, you know what? Mom and Dad, you are just old school and we don't like your 1950s goals. And so we're going to do the opposite. We're not going to buy stuff in the stores. We're going to live naturally. And we're not going to conform. We're not going to look like everyone else. And we're not going to do the things people are doing. And we're surely not going to be wholesome. We're going to do things our parents tell us not to do. And then this also affected their appearance. Because they're not conforming and because they're not being wholesome, they decided to have a whole different kind of style. So they wore mini skirts and they had clothes that were very colorful and very flamboyant, and they had like their shirts would be open, and they had long hair, and they would wear beads and they would wear feathers, and tie-dye became a thing with the hippies. And so I have some pictures of hippies for you to look at. But first, I want to show you some pictures of the protests. So here you see some protests where the men are holding signs and they say, end the war in Vietnam. And as you notice, these are not old men. These are men that could be drafted. And so they're the ones that are directly being affected by this, because tomorrow they could be drafted and they'd have to drop everything and go fight and maybe even die for the war that they don't believe in anymore. And then here's another march. And so it says, we won't fight another rich man's war on their sign. Now, who are these people? Well, these people are actually veterans who came back from Vietnam and were so upset about what they saw in Vietnam that they don't want to fight anymore. And so these are actually veterans protesting. You can see their dog tags, their uniforms. You can see by their sign that they're veterans. Okay, now we have another march. This is actually happening in Washington, right across from the Washington Monument. You can see that in the background here. It's happening at the Lincoln Memorial. So here's a sign. There's peace signs around because that was a hippie thing. And the sign says, my son was killed in Vietnam. What for? And then it says America. So this is obviously a mom that's so upset about that. And she's saying, my son died for no reason. His death didn't mean anything. I don't like this war anymore. Now we have some hippies. So the picture on the left is a hippie. You can tell that these people are hippies and they kind of look like normal people, but think back to the 1950s and how everybody had to wear a suit and have really nice hair and everything had to be perfect with their makeup and their appearance. Well, the hippies were like, yeah, well, whatever, we don't like that. So they had crazy hair that they didn't wash, and they grew really long hair. And she has a sign that says love, not war. So peace signs really become a thing because people are saying love and peace and not war. We don't want violence. We want peace in our society. And then on the right-hand side, this is actually from a very famous music festival called Woodstock. You can see that they have very colorful clothes, and one guy's not even wearing a shirt, and the men have long hair. So this would make people in the 1950s crazy. They would be like, oh my goodness, they look horrible. They need to go cut their hair and act like civilized people. But the hippies were saying, you know what? The 1950s goals did nothing for me. I might be drafted tomorrow, so I don't want to live their goals. I want to do what I want. And here's my favorite picture of hippies. So you can see that there's a guy in the sweater and he's putting flowers into guns. Sometimes the protests would attract a lot of attention and the policemen would be called in because they didn't want the protests and marches to get too out of hand. So we have the police here and he's putting flowers in their guns. What kind of messages is this sending them if he's putting flowers in their guns? Well, it's sending a message about peace and about love and not violence and guns. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson, here's what he has to say in the war room. Decision number 3. Well, I'm sorry to say, but the public really hates us. And by us, I mean me. I am getting all the flack from our decision to fight in the war. We lied to the public and reporters found us out. Now Americans have decided not to trust us. This was our fault, and now a lot of Americans feel like their country betrayed them. What advice do you have for me? What do we tell the public to gain their trust back? What do we do about this war? So what I want you to do right now is pause this video and write your answer to decision number 3. What do you tell the public to try to get their trust back? How do we win? What do we do? Pause the video right now. Okay, so at this point in the lesson, you should have already written your decision for decision number 3. Well, what really happened is he decided to continue the war. And in the next election, LBJ does not run for re-election. He had enough of the war. He could have had one more term as president, but he served one term already, which was 4 years. He could have had another 4 years, but he said, you know what? I am just so stressed about this, and I feel so bad about the war. I'm not even going to run again. So the American public elected a new guy, and the new guy's name was Richard Nixon. Well, he won the presidency because he promised, I'm going to put an end to the war. This is what he looked like, yet another not very attractive looking president of ours. But anyway, he decided, okay, I'm going to promise the Americans that I will end the war. So he becomes president. But what happens is he actually didn't end the war. In fact, he continued it, and he made it a little bit worse. And even worse than that, he started lying even more to the public. And then he broke the law as president. There's kind of a big story behind that, but basically what he did is he made illegal copies of things, recordings of things. He threatened people, he bribed people. He was not a very nice or very kind man at all. He was very paranoid. He had like enemy lists where he would write down, if I hate you, and if you're my enemy, your name is on my list. So he was just a very paranoid, not a very nice man, and he ended up being kind of corrupt. And so when it got out that he was breaking the law, he was actually he was going to be impeached by being president, but instead he resigned. He's our first and only president so far to resign the presidency because he knew he was going to be impeached, which means he can't be the president anymore. And so he really ended out his presidency very disgraceful. And the American public just went crazy about this. They were like, we cannot believe we had a corrupt man as president. We just don't even trust the government. And then what happened is in the year 1975, we lost the Vietnam War. What happened is the North Vietnamese swept into South Vietnam, and the capital of South Vietnam, called Saigon, it fell. And the North Vietnamese swarmed that city, and they declared victory, and we just left. And we gave up, and we went home. So after 20 years of being involved in Vietnam, we were done, and we lost the war. And so we left the country, and then Vietnam fell to the communists. And so North Vietnam and South Vietnam are one country today. And they are still communist today because we lost the war and communism took over the country. So I have some questions for you. Now you know the whole story of the Vietnam War. You know that we made a lot of really difficult decisions. And I want you to think about those decisions because we ended up losing that war. So there's a lot of questions I want you to consider. And then I want you to write me at least 1 or 2 sentences for each of these questions. So in total, you should have at least a paragraph in total for all of the questions. But I want to hear at least 1 or 2 sentences of your thoughts for each of the questions. So number 1 is, how were our reasons for fighting the Vietnam War different than our reasons for fighting in World War II? So think back to our 1940s lessons and what you know about World War II. Think back to that and then think about what you learned about the Vietnam War. How were our reasons for fighting the Vietnam War different than in World War II? Now, number 2, why did people begin to distrust the government during this time period? Do people trust the government today? Now, number 3, should we have been involved in Vietnam in the first place? And I want you to remember the phrase, hindsight is 20/20, because obviously if we're thinking about it from a past tense kind of view and we're thinking about the past, we know that we lost the Vietnam War. So of course we're going to say, no, we shouldn't have been involved. But I want you to think about, they didn't know they were going to lose. So considering the fact that they didn't know they were going to lose, do you think they should have been involved in Vietnam with what they did know about the war when they first entered it? Think back to that. Now, number 4, is it right for America to go into other countries and try to change what's happening in that country? So think about that and write your answer. So when you turn in this assignment, you should have a decision for number 1, 2, and 3, and you should have an answer to each of these 4 questions.